They marched across an ocean and into a different world. Captured in North Africa and on European battlefields, tens of thousands of German soldiers expected a defeated, weary America, a nation broken by internal discord, depleted by war, somehow no match for German resolve. Instead, they found cities lit up at night, farms that seemed to stretch forever, and factories that churned out entire bombers by the hour. That confrontation between expectation and reality was not just surprising. It began to undo the myths that had sustained them. Over the next months, behind barbed wire in more than 500 camps scattered across the United States, captured soldiers watched, listened, learned, and changed. This is the story of how industrial abundance, humane treatment, and quiet encounters with everyday Americans helped turn foes into witnesses, and, for many, into unexpected advocates for a very different future. If you value these vanished chapters of history, please subscribe so tomorrow's generations can hear what we still must remember.
In the summer of 1943 and into 1944, Liberty ships that had carried American troops overseas returned with a different cargo, thousands of prisoners. Men who had fought under desert suns and in Normandy's shattered hedgerows were loaded below deck, given blankets and a surprisingly full plate, and shipped across the Atlantic to the United States. The military did not send these men to be pampered. They were enemy combatants, but the practicalities of war and the obligations of the Geneva Convention shaped their reception. By the war's peak, some 425,000 Axis prisoners were in American custody. Of these, roughly 371,683 were Germans, numbers that reflected the scale of the conflict and the logistical challenge that came with it. For many prisoners, the journey itself was their first cultural shock. On board the transport ships, they were fed more generously than they had been allowed at the front. Some would later recall the bewildering kindness of being offered coffee and cigarettes, and the low, nervous laughter that comes when people who have been taught to fear one another discover a small humanity. Disembarkation at ports in New York, Boston, or Norfolk often included brief processing and then trains west and south to camps. Sites chosen for mild climate, spare infrastructure, and distance from sensitive industrial centers. The camps themselves varied. Some were repurposed training bases, others were Kent cities hastily erected on flat land. But most had a similar look: rows of barracks, watchtowers, fences, and an American flag that rose and fell each day. Expectations and anxieties ran high. Many men arriving in 1943 still believed in German victory. Propaganda and rumor had delayed the reckoning for some. Others, exhausted and hungry, were relieved simply to be off the battlefield. Among the captives were Waffen-SS, Afrika Korps veterans hardened by early Axis victories, and young conscripts pulled from farms and factories. Language mattered. The soldiers who spoke some English were, for the most part, more open to curiosity. Those who were rigidly ideological clustered together, resisting and policing dissent. American officers learned quickly that the German chain of command and internal discipline often persisted behind the wire, sometimes making the United States' job easier, sometimes more complicated. The first encounter that bluntly undermined assumptions about American weakness was industrial. Prisoners transported to the Midwest or to factory towns saw more assembly line capacity in an afternoon than entire regions of Europe had at the start of the war. The Willow Run bomber plant outside Detroit became a shorthand in German testimonies. By 1944, it was rolling a B-24 Liberator off the line every 63 minutes, a spectacle of organized mass production that embodied what Americans called the arsenal of democracy. For men who had been raised to admire disciplined efficiency and technical prowess, the sight of thousands of civilians, men and women, working in harmony to produce machines of war was dizzying. The scale of production, the confidence of the workforce, and the civic pride in that output shattered many private forecasts of American decline. But factories were only one part of the picture. Prisoners were billeted near towns where ordinary life, not just industrial life, seemed resilient. Farmers, many of them short-handed because American men were in uniform, welcomed POW labor. In fields across the Midwest and South, German prisoners picked peaches, hoed cotton, or worked in canneries. They were paid small wages, housed in barracks, and under the watchful eye of American police. For soldiers who had lived through hunger or rationing, the relative abundance, full supermarket shelves, well-stocked canteens, and plentiful bread registered as a moral shock. The American diet itself, the easy access to soap, shoes, and small comforts, conveyed an image of a society that had, against odds, preserved a certain prosperity. Many Germans compared those comforts to the privations that German civilians and even officers had endured. Camp routine sharpened perception. Men rose to reveille, ate in mess halls, attended roll calls, and worked or studied. The U.S. Army, mindful of Geneva rules and practical labor needs, organized prisoners into work details. That work, supervised and paid, exposed POWs to ordinary American people, farm families, factory supervisors, and small-town shopkeepers. Those interactions were often banal and small, a question across a fence, a borrowed tool, a Saturday afternoon where the camp baseball game drew local children. But small things accumulate. They seed a new vocabulary of normalcy and challenge ideological worlds already showing cracks. By the time the first seasonal harvests ended, many prisoners had a clearer, more complicated image of what the United States actually was. There were, of course, tensions and dark moments. Hardliners and National Socialist loyalists resisted fraternization and sometimes enforced punishment. In some camps, internecine violence, murders of prisoners accused of cooperating with Americans, shocked both guards and the prisoner population. Yet even amid those horrors, the larger arc of experience for many prisoners was one of exposure to industry, to community, and to practices of daily life that did not conform to the caricatures they had been taught. In the next months, that exposure would deepen, and for many, it would become transformative.
Time, more than coercion, proved the most powerful instrument of change. Long months in a camp are an education in small things, the steady tick of daily routine, the boredom of guarded peace, the conversations that begin with suspicion and end with shared cigarettes. The U.S. Army's approach blended obligation with opportunity. Prisoners were required to work where appropriate, and many camps offered classes and libraries. Officers and educated men organized camp universities, where lectures on law, history, and languages were offered in makeshift classrooms. For those who attended, classes were not mere pastime. They provided frameworks for rethinking authority and ideology. One future European statesman, Walter Hallstein, was captured in 1944, spent time in a U.S. camp, and organized instruction among prisoners. An example of how camp life could seed post-war leadership. Work details did more than fill idle hours. They created encounters. On farms, prisoners labored side by side with local supervisors and sometimes with hired seasonal workers. The rhythm of planting and harvest required cooperation. Trust, when earned, was rewarded with greater freedom of movement within local communities. In factories or canneries, prisoners performed skilled or semi-skilled tasks and were sometimes surprised to be treated as useful labor rather than mere enemies. That practical dignity, paid labor, contracts, and regulated hours, contrasted starkly with the hierarchical, terror-laced life many had left behind in Nazi Germany.
Conversations over a lunch pail could turn to politics, incredulous questions about how a society with so many immigrants, so many faiths could function peacefully, astonishment at the presence of women in supervisory roles, curiosity about how local governments operated. These informal lessons chipped away at assumptions about order, race, and governance. Information mattered. After the European camps and the liberation of concentration camps, American authorities streamed information and footage to select POW audiences. Documentaries about concentration camps, carefully curated and shown in camps after VE Day, confronted prisoners with the reality of Nazi crimes. The effect was uneven. Some prisoners were already aware of atrocities. Others had remained in ignorance, sheltered by propaganda and the fog of war. But when the truth was presented, often with interviews and documentary evidence, cognitive dissonance intensified. Men who had fought in distant theaters could not easily reconcile images of industrialized mass murder with any moral defense of the regime. In many camps, this led to heated debates, denouncements, and in some cases, formal renunciations of Nazi ideology. The discipline inside camps also helped shape new allegiances. Many prisoners had once been subject to strict military order that demanded unquestioning obedience. In camp, however, American camp policy emphasized legal process, individual dignity, and the rule of law. Prisoners who witnessed courts, due process, and structured grievance mechanisms began to recognize a different set of civic principles. The U.S. Army's own records show that these experiences were not accidental. The War Department and selected academic and civic groups saw re-education as a wartime necessity. Programs like the Sunflower Project and other administrative schools offered instruction on democracy, constitutionality, and public administration. These programs did not force belief. They presented ideas and let time do the rest. Everyday kindnesses mattered as much as formal instruction. Letters from family in the U.S., visits by American religious and civic groups, and the occasional invitation to a local event created small human bridges. Stories survive of farmers offering fresh milk to a tired prisoner, or a camp librarian recommending a book that altered a man's view of history. Those small acts, multiplied across hundreds of camps, accumulated into a pattern. For many prisoners, the United States became less an anonymous enemy and more a living, variegated society, one with faults, yes, but also with work, institutions, and private kindness. Not all prisoners converted their politics. Some remained fervent believers in Nazism. Others never fully reconciled with the images of public life they observed. There were also security incidents, escape attempts. 2,222 prisoners managed to escape at one point or another, although most were quickly recaptured. Violence among prisoners, and ideological enforcement by camp hardliners. But these incidents were numerically small. Less than 1% of prisoners attempted escape, a statistic that helps explain why the United States was able to manage such a large internment population with relatively few catastrophic incidents. The psychological profile of transformation was often gradual. A soldier might begin by acknowledging small practical benefits, better food, a dry bed, an accessible latrine, and then through conversation, observe civic practices he had never seen, a woman running a town council meeting, a Black American soldier assigned as an officer in the segregated army, or an elected mayor answering public criticism. These informal lessons chipped away at assumptions about order, race, and governance. Letters home complicate the picture. Some ex-prisoners later wrote that their captivity in the U.S. was a turning point. Others minimized its effect. Yet the post-war record suggests that the exposure mattered. When the men returned to a defeated Germany, many carried with them not only technical skills learned on American farms and in factories, but memories of an alternative civic life. For officers and educated prisoners who later entered public service or academia, camp experience sometimes crystallized into a program: how to rebuild Germany with democratic institutions, a functioning economy, and the moral clarity demanded after catastrophe. The American camps, then, were both a holding pen and an unexpected site of civic transmission.
The end of hostilities did not mean the immediate end of prisoner experience. Repatriation was phased and often slow. Political considerations, labor needs, and logistics delayed return voyages. By mid-1946, many prisoners had been sent home, but the memory of months in America remained. The effect of that memory showed up in political life across the devastated zones of post-war Germany. Men who had once been prisoners took up roles in Reconstruction, in municipal governments, in universities, and in the civil service. Some, like Walter Hallstein, used their time in the camps to develop organizational skills and visions for a democratic future. Hallstein's later career, including his leadership role in European integration, has sometimes been traced back to his camp experiences, where he ran educational programs and encountered ideas about law and governance that differed markedly from Nazi doctrine. The broader statistical imprint is harder to measure, but no less real. American policymakers and sociologists tracked repatriated prisoners' employment and political alignments. Veterans of the camps resurfaced in professions where pragmatic, non-authoritarian approaches were necessary. The American model, a mixed economy buoyed by strong civic institutions, offered a template in contrast to the totalizing state many had known. The Marshall Plan, NATO, and the American presence in Western Germany provided economic substance to political ideas, but the human stories mattered too. The men who had worked in American fields and factories often championed productive cooperation and municipal rebuilding. In local councils and labor unions, former POWs used the technical and managerial skills they had acquired to rebuild roads, revitalize factories, and modernize agriculture. One striking long-term effect was on elite opinion. Many of Germany's post-war administrators and intellectuals had direct or indirect contact with camp-educated figures. The so-called barbed wire universities produced lectures on constitutionalism and public administration that fed into the nascent West German state. While not every student of the barbed wire classroom became a Democrat, the diffusion of administrative knowledge mattered in a country starting from ground zero. When the Federal Republic of Germany formed in 1949, it leaned toward institutions that emphasized the rule of law, decentralized authority, and market mechanisms, ideas that had been discussed in camp classrooms and in quiet conversations between prisoners and Americans. There were also human reconciliations. Years after the war, former POWs returned to the towns where they had worked, invited by families who had hosted them or by civic memorial efforts. Reunion narratives often mixed gratitude and awkwardness. Gratitude for having been treated fairly, awkwardness about what had been done by the regime they once served. In some American farming communities, long friendships grew from those frail beginnings. Men who had been captors or supervisors maintaining correspondence with ex-prisoners who became colleagues in peacetime business ventures. These smaller stories of friendship complicate the more dramatic political narratives. They demonstrate how ordinary human relationships contributed, in small accumulative ways, to post-war reconciliation. Yet the story is not one of uniform conversion. Across Germany, the legacy of the camps interacted with region, social class, and wartime experience. Areas that fell under Soviet control developed different post-war political cultures, less shaped by American encounters. In Western zones, American cultural and economic influence was stronger, and camp alumni sometimes played outsized roles in rebuilding local institutions. The Cold War would soon reorder priorities. Anti-communism, economic recovery, and strategic alignment with the West overtook many wartime debates about re-education. Still,
The person-to-person impact of camp experience remained an underappreciated vector in the creation of post-war democratic culture. Historically, some scholars have called the U.S. POW camps a forgotten re-education program, not because it was secret, but because it relied on indirect, everyday tactics rather than coercion. Films and books shown in camps, vocational training, supervised labor, and classroom debates were tools of influence, not propaganda in the crude sense. The American strategy hinged on demonstration. Show a functioning industrial society where law and civic practice worked, and many observers will reevaluate former certainties. The Willow Run factories, farm fields, and civic institutions were not only productive, they were persuasive. They provided living evidence that a different, non-totalitarian path to prosperity and dignity was possible. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the men who had been prisoners were citizens of a remade Europe. Some entered public life, others quietly rebuilt families and businesses. The arc from captor to captive to cautious collaborator is not a tidy moral tale, but a complex human one. The camps did not single-handedly reconstruct Germany's political culture. External forces, mass migration, economic aid, and geopolitical strategy all mattered. But for many individual lives, the months in American custody were a hinge, a period when exposure to industrial capacity, civic institutions, and everyday humane conduct loosened the hold of an ideology that had demanded absolute allegiance. Those moments of loosened faith would, on many small but consequential levels, help shape the democratic Germany that followed.
History rarely hands us clean conversions or instant miracles. It offers slow changes, personal reckonings, and the occasional unmistakable turn. The story of German POWs in the United States is one of those turns, not heroic propaganda, but prolonged exposure to a different way of life. Factories rolling bombers every hour, farm fields worked side by side with local families, and classrooms inside wire fences all combined to make hard facts and human kindness undeniable. For many prisoners, those facts unraveled old certainties. For others, they left questions that time and politics would answer in varying ways. Remembering these stories matters. If you found value in hearing how ordinary people and institutions helped bend the arc of history, please subscribe so this complex human chapter is kept alive for the next generation of listeners.